Hey, I'm Dirac Twidwell. I'm a associate professor and rangeland ecologist at the University of Nebraska. I'm also serving in a capacity as a science advisor role for the USDA-NRCS for the Great Plains region. And really, we were asked to uh, help provide a better science-based strategy to deal with the problem of woody encroachment in Great Plains grasslands. Um, and help NRCS partners and landowners to get ahead of this issue. It's something that's definitely been one of those impossible challenges in rangelands almost for the Great Plains. There's very few large-scale success stories, and we were able to really start working with these larger landowner groups. Uh, different prescribed burn associations, like the Les Canyons of Nebraska, groups that often function larger and across neighboring properties, like the Sandhills Task Force, landowners in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and including landowners, like the area of the Gypsum Hills in South Central Kansas. These larger landowner groups were trying to create creative ideas and ways of solving the woody encroachment problem. And by working hand in hand with them at large scales, we were starting to be able to really develop scientific solutions that not only benefited those regions, but benefit our whole knowledge set on how to better address the issue. Now, what we saw, and across the Great Plains as a whole, and the Great Plains you can see in this map, expands really from the Rocky Mountains here to the west, all the way to this eastern border, and the sea of grass that defines the biome of the Great Plains. And everywhere that you see more in blue here today is grassland dominated ecosystems. And these places that are red, like the Black Hills of South Dakota, this area of red in the middle of the Sandhills is Halsey National Forest, which is hand-planted cedar forest there. Those are tree-dominated systems. So you can see this boundary that exists today of where grassland ecosystems are winning versus where a woody-dominated biome is winning. And we're able to showcase where that biome exists and realize biomes have been conserved since really the last ice age. And so if we see movement at biome scales, that fundamentally changes how these systems work. And that's what we've been able to track and see. And that's why we're working with landowners across these regions. Over a 20-year period, you're talking about significant and substantial losses of our grassland biome to now what's this more woody pressure and woody dominated system. And when that biome hits you, it increases the management costs to rangeland producers, and it makes it much more difficult for us to sustain these last iconic grassland ecosystems. Now, we spend a ton of money in grasslands on brush management and woody encroachment, but we tend to spend that money in the red, the areas that become a huge problem after after this initial resource concern. We tend to wait until it's this bigger investment, and that costs a lot of money. And so we spent $177 million in the last farm bill, for example, on brush management. Most of those funds go into the red. And it starts to beg the question, what if we got out in front of it? Because that experiment has played out. And so that's when we started really coming down to Kansas and, at the request of producer groups to say, hey, can we come up with better solutions to deal with this issue, given what hasn't worked in the past? Now, of course, there's the issue of the cost of managing it, but there's also associated with the production costs on rangelands. Now, this is how, coming from Nebraska, of course, and every other Great Plains state, we grow a lot of biomass in the Great Plains. Corn is estimated at 1.68 billion bushels, these mind-boggling stats. And we haven't had those kind of stats in rangelands. And that's what we really want to know. And because of platforms like the Rangeland Analysis platform, we're actually able to give that to producers now. So corn in the state of Kansas, right, a couple of years ago when we started really working with producers there, 44 billion pounds, sorghum, 11 billion pounds. And we now know that Kansas rangeland, right, almost 60 billion pounds produced that 1 year. Very low input system with a lot of benefits to it. And we see that economic gain. So we're talking about 60 billion pounds of Kansas rangeland. Now, of course, with the woody encroachment that's expanding across the biome, how many pounds have been lost to woody encroachment? That's our big question. And we now have the answers to that. So we're able to come down into Kansas, say we're talking about 3 billion pounds of rangeland productivity that wasn't available for the livestock industry and for other ecosystem services and things like wildlife that would have been there if we kept 1990 woody encroachment levels constant. And we can start to nail down what's happening in individual counties, on individual properties, and really better understand the risks that are at play and how it's moving in the state of Kansas from the east further and further into the west. And historically, we thought maybe the west wouldn't have that problem, right? It was too arid. We're continually seeing areas that didn't have the problem in the past, future generations having to solve those issues. So we have the information on the losses happening to agricultural industry associated with livestock on rangeland. And that's something we shouldn't take for granted given these costs and the production value that it has. One of the challenges is just how we viewed this problem. Usually we wait until there's this large amount of woody encroachment on the landscape, like this picture here you're seeing on the left side of the graph. And when we were flying over, we were documenting often these areas to the right that we tend to not focus on and manage. We don't think that there's a problem there yet. And we say, oh, those are intact rangeland acres. Well, in reality, they're not. What they are is they're future encroachment acres. These areas are contaminated by seed from those mature trees that are just on that neighboring property or in that neighboring pasture. And if we wait, what happens? Those seeds reproduce, they germinate, and it forms future trees that we have to manage. So we're always chasing the problem. And it's basically like being kind of ambulance drivers. We're constantly, chasing the problem into our best intact and most productive rangelands. That's an unwinnable strategy for managing this problem. If we're going to correctly manage this issue, we have to get ahead of this spatial pattern of encroachment and start to anchor conservation areas to intact grassland core areas. And that's one of the things that we missed with kind of our science-based guidance in the past. They reproduce by seed, and most of that seed recruits within a very close proximity to seed sources. Instead of chasing future trees, let's start getting ahead of the problem. That's where this philosophy is coming in, and we see groups that are using this philosophy tend to win. So instead of being ambulance drivers, get ahead of it, defend the core, grow the core, keep our best and most productive rangelands intact. So let's go to an example in Kansas. Here's an area of south central Kansas in the Gypsum Hills, one of these big iconic grassland regions that are remaining. And let's walk through an example that we did with them there in terms of being able to get ahead of the issue and what that means for that area. So here we're starting in 2000, and we were kind enough to be given information by producers of where they were trying to build core areas and protect them. And let's just watch why that becomes such an important issue long-term now. Over time, everywhere red looks more like these cedar-dominated areas. Everywhere green is more these grassland-dominated areas. And watch this expansion in the Gypsum Hills. Again, the plight to producers and the cost to their rangeland production, you really see how quickly this is taking off in areas like this. And by 2015, you have this huge multi-county problem at your hands that's so expensive to manage. And as we play this forward, all of a sudden you see what emerges is this big kind of chunk taken out of those cedar-dominated zones, and that was Anderson Creek wildfire here. Took a huge amount of area, killed a lot of cedar trees, and what this producer group started to do is double down following that wildfire and make sure that it didn't come back, that any of the cedar trees that it missed, they were going to start to take those seed sources out, really start to manage seed that might be residually left over in the seed bank by restoring prescribed fire at large scales. And really look how you see that signal kind of hardening, right? There's these core areas in these green zones that are strongly intact grasslands, and they're continuing to try and firm up. The benefits to this to the producer are huge. Instead of waiting until you have this huge economic impact to your livelihood up to 75% of your livelihood on rangeland, get ahead of that. We don't want them to lose that economic value of their land. We want to prevent that from happening. So in those areas, we were actually able to study that and measure it and quantify it, and see the benefits of building cores rather than chasing the problem. So on that gypsum hills or the red hills, if you look at how much is lost to production in terms of millions of pounds since 1990, that's something we call yield gap. That gap of the yield that we'd like to have and its potential versus what we're observing. And we're talking about 60 million pounds in the gypsum hills since 1990. But look at that producer group on 91,000 acres. We're talking about they were losing that production. Anderson Creek wildfire happens, and then they double down on their management to really reclaim and restore lost production. This is a classic example of defending the core, starting to grow the core, and really prevent it from becoming a problem again during the long haul. We're talking about the restoration right now of 1.5 million pounds in this multi-producer group. That's the first time that we've seen with data a documented success story where groups lost that much regional production and were able to band together following this initial, wildfire event, but band together to reclaim lost production through follow-up management. And that's by getting after the problem earlier, really trying to maintain this rangeland as a treeless landscape that's not at risk to future encroachment. That makes it easier for future generations to be able to thrive on this landscape. It keeps other things like wildlife, water, wildfire danger lower. Just a huge benefit for the communities in these areas by keeping grassland, and really productive in terms of Kansas agriculture. And so this has been great for me to be a part of and work with these producers and see how to better manage this threats. We're expecting more of this to come for the state. Thank you.